Hello, my name's Chantel, and today I'll be presenting on our study on pain and spinal postural control. We asked the question, does lumbar pain, anticipation of lumbar pain, or limb pain alter the neuromuscular response to sudden axial load? Pain can change motor control. We've seen it change the way we move and the way our patients move. In fact, experimental pain studies have demonstrated that muscle timing and mechanical behavior changes with pain. Hodges and colleagues showed delayed onset of transversus abdominis and multifidus with experimental pain during self-generated arm movements. Mosley and colleagues demonstrated even just the anticipation of pain is sufficient to delay onset of deep trunk muscles. Interestingly, there are also conflicting findings that have shown that motor control doesn't change with pain. This presents us with a problem. Does pain change motor control? The above studies involve mostly self-generated movements like arm movements and walking. However, the response to sudden perturbations aren't well understood. Sudden loading paradigms are relevant to everyday scenarios such as slips and falls when perturbations are unanticipated. In people with back pain, they showed patterns of co-contraction and delayed muscle onset and offset in response to sudden loading in flexion, extension, and lateral flexion. While these directions have been studied, very little is known about loading in the axial direction. Axial loading is extremely interesting because it's a model for anything requiring vertical impulses such as running, carrying a backpack, and vertical impact injuries. A recent study looking at sudden axial loading dropped 20% of body weight onto the participants' shoulders in healthy participants. They found a top-down onset from C7 to glutes as expected, and while this study showed the muscle responses without pain, our study is the first to investigate the effect of pain on the trunk muscle response to axial loading. We aim to determine if experimental pain, anticipation of pain, or pain at a remote site affects trunk muscle onset timing in response to sudden axial load. We hypothesized that firstly, experimental low back pain would cause a delay in muscle onset timing, that anticipation of low back pain would cause a similar effect to experimental pain in muscle onset timing, and lastly, pain at a remote site, being the left knee, would not cause a significant change in muscle onset timing compared to pain locally at the low back. We recruited 13 healthy participants, and our exclusion criteria excluded those with a history of back pain that needed 2 days rest or treatment from a health professional, as well as any condition that could affect spinal symmetry. If we have a look at our experimental setup, we use surface EMGs as indicated by these electrodes at the region of the spinal extensors at C7, T5, T11, and L5, the upper quadrant of gluteus maximus, and the internal and external oblique abdominal muscles. Here we can see a wooden platform that elevates and drops the load via a pulley and winch mechanism, and by placing steel shots onto the wooden platform, the load was adjusted to 20% of the participant's body weight. The input force was measured via the force transducers as shown in the circles, and that's the wooden board, and the output force was measured via a calibrated force plate on which the participant stood, indicated by the white arrows. And to elicit experimental low back pain, we used electrical stimulation, and we can see the blue stimulation electrodes placed bilaterally at L3. We adjusted the electrical stimulation intensity such that the patient experienced a 5 out of 10 on the numerical rating scale. Now, talking a little bit about the order of trials. So we started off with 5 control trials. So if we look at the graph here, we can see that there is no pain stimulus and just a load drop. And we can see that the green box down here is indicating the force transducer that is detecting the load onset. Then we are moving on to 5 pain concurrent with load trials. What this means is that the load drop occurs concurrently or at the same time as the pain stimulus, and the stimulus is at the low back. Now, the purpose of this was to create an anticipation of pain, as the patient would then expect that the pain and load drop would occur at the same time. This was followed by 20 trials that randomized pain concurrent with load and pain after load. For the pain after load condition, we can see that the load drops first and then the pain stimulus occurs. So what we're actually recording at the time of the load drop is a response to the anticipation of pain, because the previous trials preconditioned them to expect that the pain and load would occur at the same time. This was followed by 5 more control trials to make sure that the back pain trials didn't affect the following trials, and we then concluded with 10 knee pain trials that were concurrent with load drop. So the knee pain is the same time as the load drop. Gathering this EMG data, the average background activity was calculated from 250 milliseconds before the load increase. So we can see that the red line signifies the load onset, the blue line signifies 250 milliseconds before that, and that's how we calculate the average baseline activity. The onset of muscle activity is defined as the time when muscle activity exceeded 4 standard deviations above the average baseline activity that we calculated and maintained this for more than 10 milliseconds. Now we also confirmed that the baseline activity between conditions within each muscle was consistent, and this is important because if the baseline activity were to be increased for any of the conditions, the sensitivity to detect a difference in the onset times would be reduced. Now, because we did surface EMG, cardiac artifacts are inevitable, and 75 trials were excluded due to that. Having a look at our results. So if we have a look at this graph, on the x-axis we have the muscle onset time, and on the y-axis we have our different muscles that we recorded. First thing we can observe is a general top-down pattern, as we expected. So we can see that C7 has the shortest onset time, so onset's first, followed by T5, your abdominals, as well as T11, L5, and glute max having the latest onset. So this is consistent with the previous study. Now, if we zoom in a little bit and look at what's happening within each muscle, so we can see that for C7, the blue is control, the red is pain concurrent, the orange is pain after, and the green is knee pain. We can see that there are no significant differences between each condition within C7, within T5, and within your internal and external oblique abdominal muscles. For T11, we can see that there are also no significant differences between the control, the pain after, and the knee pain conditions. Now you can observe that the red bar, the pain concurrent condition, is absent in T11, L5, and glute max. This was because of an interesting finding where there was a persistence of muscle activity that extended into the window of time that we would expect a muscle onset, therefore limiting our ability to identify an onset time. Now I'll expand on this a bit further. So if we have a look at these two figures here, on the x-axis, again we have the onset time, and on the y-axis we have the muscles. The red line here signifies the load onset, which is time equals 0, and the blue bars here, they signify the onset of each muscle. So we can see that after the load onset, after a period of time, we can see C7 has the first muscle onset, followed by T5 and your abdominals, and then T11, L5, and glute. So your general top-down pattern, as we have discussed and seen in the previous graph. Now, if we look at the bottom figure, the squiggly green line here signifies the duration of the pain stimulus, and the red bars again signify the muscle onset. Now, we can see that generally during the pain stimulus there is muscle activation. However, when this pain stimulus stops or ceases, then the muscle activity also ceases. However, we can observe that for T11, L5, and glutes, there is this persistence of muscle activity here that extends into the window of time where we would expect a muscle onset to be identified. So, although this limited our ability to identify onset times for these particular muscles, this was an unexpected and interesting finding that the persistence of muscle activity only occurred in the muscles regionally closest to the stimulus at L3. So, only T11, L5, and glutes showed this persistence of muscle activity, while distant portions of the muscle, such as C7, were unaffected. So, in discussion, we found that experimental pain and anticipation of pain, as well as limb pain, didn't change muscle onset times in response to sudden axial load, which was actually different to our hypothesis. However, rather than seeing a global adaptation in muscle onset timing, there was a region-specific response where activity persisted in the muscles that were anatomically closest to the pain stimulus. So it's not that the muscle changes its time to switch on, but that it takes longer to switch off. This is consistent with the study by Radebold, who showed patterns of co-contraction and delayed offset of deep trunk muscles during sudden loading in patients with clinical low back pain. In terms of limitations and recommendations, inherently there are limitations to electrical stimulation, and as we found in our study, there's this persistence of activity. This leads us to recommending other methods of inducing experimental pain, such as hypertonic saline injections, and investigating the onset as well as the offset with experimental pain models. As we only investigated the muscle onset, the muscle amplitude remains to be investigated. This study also paves the way for future studies to compare people with a history of clinical low back pain to the results of the current cohort of pain-free people. Thank you, and any questions are welcome.